Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Professor David Jasper, and on behalf of the University of Glasgow and the Gifford Committee of the University, I welcome you to the first of the 2010 Gifford Lectures. We're deeply honoured by the presence of Professor Gianni Vattimo, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the University of Turin, as our Gifford Lecturer this year. Lord Gifford's deed of foundation for the lectures requires the university, and I quote, to use diligence to secure lecturers who are true thinkers, sincere lovers of, and earnest inquirers after truth. In Professor Vattimo, we cannot be accused of having failed in our task. One of the foremost philosophers in the world today, he is also a major voice in European and world politics. Educated as a Roman Catholic, even as a teenager introduced to the study of Thomas Aquinas, he resisted the rigid and dogmatic elements in the Church's educational system. Yet, the matter of Christianity and belief has remained close to the heart of his work through his vision, though his vision and philosophy are utterly universal. Professor Vattimo's studies began at the University of Turin, from where he moved to Heidelberg to work under Hans-Jörg Gadamer. And hermeneutics remain at the heart of his thinking. We live, to quote the title of one of his recent essays, in the age of interpretation. An essay which begins with the proposal of Nietzsche that there are no facts, only interpretations. But this itself, Vattimo observes, is not an objective metaphysical proposition. Itself, it is only an interpretation. Perhaps the greatest intellectual influence on his thinking is Martin Heidegger. And after Nietzsche and Heidegger, Vattimo suggests philosophy must be an adventure of difference, avoiding any tendency to reduce everything to a single ideological principle. And he's best known and acclaimed for his philosophy as weak thought. That is, in the words of his colleague, whom we're delighted is also present with us this evening, Dr. Santiago Zabala, his weakening of the metaphysical nature of intellectual power, scientific methods, and religious beliefs, and our dogmatic interpretation of them. There are few major thinkers in the modern and postmodern era with whom Professor Vattimo has not conversed and engaged. At the same time, his has been a key voice in the political thinking of Europe, not least as a member of the European Parliament, to which he was recently re-elected. In 2002, he was awarded the Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thinking, arguing for a global political system whose unity lies in the harmony of diversities. Professor Vattimo, we thank you for the honour which you bestow upon us in your coming to the University of Glasgow as our Gifford Lecturer. And so, without any more ado, we turn to the first lecture, Tarski and the quotation marks of his principle. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren. Like Gadamer always started his lectures. I am fully aware of the honor I received by being invited to this Gifford lectures, which I consider really as a Nobel Prize for philosophy. By the way, it exists no Nobel Prize for philosophy. So it's a luck, because I don't have to expect the Nobel Prize. There is no Nobel Prize for philosophy. Okay, but the Gifford lectures are something of the kind, so I am very glad and very, a little bit also excited by the idea, emotioned by the idea of being here, where so many other more important, well, sometimes important philosophers, even more important than me, have been invited. Professor Jaspers has already a little bit started or described my starting point, which is my belonging to the hermeneutic school. I remember that the first time I went to the United States in '72, which is one millennium ago, the other millennium, when I spoke of hermeneutics, people asked, Herman who? It was very, it is, okay, it is a sort of joke, but as a matter of fact, it's true that in more recent times, between the 80s and the 2000, I can say that what in the United States used to be existential and continental philosophy has become hermeneutic. So it exists in the United States as society, as PEP, which sounds nice, Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy. They still call themselves like that, but as a matter of fact, what was the continental existential phenomenological philosophy is more and more hermeneutic recently. So I don't want to say that I won against the people saying Herman who, but in a certain sense, it is something more better known now, hermeneutics, than it was many years ago. Having said that, and of course, let me thank again and again the University of Glasgow, the committee, the Gifford Foundation for the foundation of the Gifford lectures. I don't know. I have read so many important texts of philosophy marked by the fact of them being presented for the first time in the Gifford lectures that I really know and what it means to be here and to propose to you my reflections. So thanks very much. Thanks a lot. It's rather familiar. Thanks a lot for this invitation. And let me start to read my text, because if I go on talking my bad English, I don't know when I'm going to finish. It's also an act of respect for you, of course, to read the most clearly possible my translated text. Allow me to begin with an autobiographical reference to my past and my present as a believing or half-believing Christian or Catholic, or what you mean, what you want. A reference that is, however, not at all out of place in a context where theology has its role. I met at least 2 professors of divinity here, which is, with the third one would be professors of Trinity, but okay. No, it sounds for us in Italian to be a professor of divinity is really a strange expression, but of course it depends on the different traditions and so on. So theology is not out of place in this environment. And I want to start with an expression from the Latin breviary, the Book of Hours, which I used to read, and also I still use to read, not being a priest and not being an Orthodox Papist, but I like it. There is a part of a prayer which says, Redemisti nos Domine Deus Veritatis. You redeemed us, God, the God of truth. The emphasis in this expression rests on the term veritas, which has always characterized much of the history of philosophy, of theology, and of religious experience. Is it possible, this is my first question, that the veritas of which this passage speaks, and that especially when it is associated with the name of God, has the power to redeem us, is the same one defined by the principle of Tarski, following that, which is the training between quotation marks is true if and only if it is raining. If you call truth this, what has this to do? What meaning still has the expression redemisti nos domine Deus veritatis? Within this question, or if one prefers, within this paradox, one can resume the philosophical work, at least the most recent part of it, that has earned me the honor of this invitation. I am well aware of the importance of this occasion when I think of the names of the philosophers who have given the Gifford lectures, which I have always viewed more or less as a Nobel Prize in philosophy. I anticipated already this. Thank. Well, the reflection that I intend to present to you concerning the end of reality begin with this very paradox about the notion of truth. I would not be able to say to what extent this is an objective description of the itinerary that has led me to my provisional conclusions about reality, being, and the meaning of existence. These, by the way, are the traditional themes of every philosophical meditation, more or less those that Kant condensed in the three famous questions: what can I know? What ought I to do? What can I hope? However, I must say that today it really seems to me that there is a linear development from my first encounter with Martin Heidegger's critique of the metaphysical conception of truth, correspondence of proposition to the rest, coincidencia, etc., correspondencia, to the idea from that first encounter with Heidegger's critique of the notion of the metaphysical notion of truth, to the idea of the weakening of the being of entities as the only possible philosophy of history and theory of emancipation. The importance of quotation marks has already been emphasized many times in philosophical discourse. I will recall here only the decisive reflection that Jacques Derrida conducted on a page of the critical edition of the works of Nietzsche, that contained, among others, also this sentence between quotation marks: I have forgotten my umbrella, quotation marks closed, and included in the critical edition of the works. So it's, in a sense, it's rather astonishing and humoristic in many senses. Certainly there are examples of similar notations, reference to banal aspects of daily life in Kant's Opus Posthumum. There is some note on the fact that the fish was too much cooked or too much not cooked enough among the. However, if I am not wrong, there was not a question of quotation marks, but only a matter of annotation undeservedly mixed with comments of a more philosophical nature. So it was, one uses to think that Kant was already a little bit, old when he mixed his philosophical observations and his everyday notations. Nevertheless, I do not intend to linger here on Derrida's Nietzschean reflections. The reference serves only as an example and also as an occasion to honor a friend and a teacher who generated many of the spurs that have led me to the conclusions under discussion, Jacques Derrida. Then, why do the quotation marks in Tarski's principle warrant so much attention in the present discussion? I know well that there have been many debates about the principle, not about the quotation marks, and I do not intend, or perhaps I would not know how, to take them up here. I will begin only by remembering another friend and teacher who is gone, Richard Rorty, who in dialogue with Pascal Engel in a small book which is entitled What's the Use of Truth, claims not to be interested in the argument over realism and anti-realism that still engages part of contemporary philosophy. The argument, namely, over the meaning one can attribute to Tarski's famous principle, according to which P is true if and only if P. P, between quotation marks, is true if and only if P. I have started to reflect more upon this principle recently because I never understood what it meant. I thought it was an example of the uselessness of all this logical construction, but of course it is not the case. It was my ignorance because I didn't remark enough the quotation marks. Translated, this means, and this is for today a useful translation. It is raining, between quotation marks, is true if and only if it is raining. The quotation marks are crucial, obviously, or not very obviously for outside the realm of the interlocutors interested in this debate. Indeed, as Rorty's example shows, Tarski's famous principle can be for many, not only for laymen but also for some philosophers, just one more proof of the uselessness of a certain type of philosophy. But prior to the argument over its utility, Tarski's principle confronts a problem that is still more radical. Does the second P really stand outside of quotation marks? Who says such a thing? Above all else, the response to this question helps delineate the answer to Rorty's question about the usefulness or uselessness of the principle. The one who says or claims or affirms that P should stand outside of quotation marks is probably somebody who benefits from its being stated in this way. Also, his affirmation must be placed. I had some doubts about this is because I assumed that it was a man. I should write like Rorty, who used to say is, or sometimes he changes the genre of the person. So he speaks of he and then it becomes a she, just in order to violate this masculine. So as an Italian, I don't want to do this game of politically correctness because it's too complicated for me. But remember that when I say is, I say the human being in its, in its or in his or in her general nature. Also, this affirmation must be placed between quotation marks. The reason usually put forward for accepting that the second P stands outside of quotation marks is that otherwise a large part of our discourses about the true, false, justified and unjustified claims, the rationality or irrationality of our behavior, political and ethical decisions and so on, would be in vain. They would not in their own right make any sense. Every time that we challenge a thesis, that we claim something against something else, we use a distinction between P, quotation, and P without quotations. The argument in favor of Tarski's principles, therefore, is that we need this principle. But yet again, who needs it? And, above all, such an argument, contrary to Rorty's pragmatic relativism and mine and so on, is clearly self-contradictory. The thesis of Tarski ought to be accepted only because it is true, not because we, one, a specific audience and so on, need it in order to make sense of our discourses. As we see, here we are wrapped up in a series of questions that seem to find no conclusion at all. or that can be avoided only if one rejects the question of who says that. But this is a question that cannot be avoided, it seems, unless one wants to exclude it by an authoritarian decision, again, a practical authoritarian decision, obviously not so purely philosophical. The question, as you may understand, is that which Nietzsche brutally resolves by writing, "There are no facts, only interpretations, and even this is an interpretation." It's a note of the late, but no note on, well, in the same manuscript in which you find the question of the umbrella. So you could say, okay, let's not take it too seriously. But this seems to be more serious in the general theory of Nietzsche. He says there are no facts, only interpretation, and this is also an interpretation. Even one who suggests that we accept Tarski's thesis claims that we cannot do without it if we have to explain our common experience. But our common experience, that which is also called in some book of neo-empirists, the greatest evidence available here and now, also this is an interpretation. We tend not to call it an interpretation only in order to distinguish it from more markedly individual opinions, which we often say are only interpretations. But wouldn't a good positivist also say that there are no facts unless they are ascertained, experienced, recognized by someone as such? Of course, the counter-objection will be, well, but what about the history of the Earth before the appearance of humans? If we speak of it, we are obviously situating it within a framework, within a conceptual scheme. If not, it is as if it never was. If we don't speak of that, it existed probably, but we cannot say anything, because when we say it, we situate it within a scheme, a framework. However, we suffer the consequences of what happened on the earth before our appearance, the appearance of man, the effect it has on us, even if we know nothing of it. Therefore, it is something real prior to and outside of our discourse about it. Certainly it is, but as it is reflected in us, it is already in some senses relative in relation to us. I am simply developing a hermeneutic discussion of the pretended reality out there, of course. But thus justifying the interpretative character of every truth claim means that there are no things unless we invent them. Empirical idealism, Berkeley, esse est percipi. Or that the order in which they appear in a set established by us, more or less arbitrarily. I propose here the two possible answers. Either a sort of what we call in the Latin languages empirical idealism, which we attribute to Berkeley. Empirical idealism, yes. We create things as far as we perceive them. Or in other terms, in Kantian terms, are we to think that organizing the phenomena within the a priori forms of which Kant spoke is a way of imposing subjectively, arbitrarily, our will to the world? Kant, who is not at all a dead dog, claims that we cannot know the things in themselves, but only those which appear phenomenally within the scope of our a priori forms, time, space, and categories. Should we therefore say that every distinction between mere idle talk and true propositions ought to be erased? If we say that the difference between true and false is always a difference between more or less shared and acceptable interpretations, we hold this very same distinction, and we have no need to imagine the fact that exists outside of every human apprehension. But note that I don't want to deny that there is something. I am not an anti-realist in the sense that I want to say that there is nothing outside of me. Simply, I don't know why I should accept this idea. And I ask, why would it be necessary to accept this idea? Who is not satisfied by this solution? By the solution of speaking of true and false, distinguishing between more generally accepted and less generally accepted propositions. To what or to whom is truth without quotation marks useful? Perhaps, as someone suggests, it might serve to place the existing order under question. Take enlightenment and revolution, human rights against totalitarianism, the progress of knowledge against obscurantism, and so on. But is it really so? Let's not forget, by the way, that exactly the church, and very often princes and governments, have always thundered against Kant and this perverse subjectivism. I remember my parishioner, my curé, saying, quello sciagurato di Kant, that horrible man of Kant, from the pulpit of the church. Why? People didn't know anything about Kant, by the way. But the few students of philosophy said, why should Kant be so were ill-treated? Now, but the fact that authorities of any kind have always been against the idea of interpretation, subjectivity, and defending the notion of objective reality should at least suggest some prudence in saying that if you want to oppose a totalitarian power, you have to be able to refer to an objectivity. Because generally the totalitarian powers have been, for many times, for a long time, favorable to the idea of the objectivity. I am an Italian pseudo-Catholic, so I know what I say, of course. Are we, by the way, when I say this, am I discovering a truth about truth? Am I saying it is true that Tarski's thesis is useful to whomever possesses the power to impose his own interpretation as the only true one? Again, it is always a commentary upon the sentence of Nietzsche, of course. I am not stating a truth about the fact that the idea of truth is false and so on. As good pragmatists may be with a smattering of Marx's critique of ideology, we will only say that it is what sounds to us like truth that which is able to set us free. That is the truth, by the way. We cannot ever pretend to have a God's eye point of view. We can only recognize that we see things according to certain prejudices, to certain interests, and if the truth is ever possible, it is the result of an agreement that is necessitated not by any definitive evidence, but only by charity, by solidarity, by the human, all too human, need to live in agreement with others. It is not that strange, but note that here I substitute charity and solidarity for truth, which seems to me very important and also related to my Christian provenance. Also same, if you ask a realist Tarskian why one ought to admit that it is raining when it is raining, he will refer you back to common experience. If you go out, you get wet, so please, it is raining. Or he will tell you, ask the other who are going out now or are coming back in from outside, and they are wet, so they will say you, it is raining. But that everyone turns to you and agrees that it is raining, wouldn't that be the effect of a shared interpretation? Everyone means those to whom we can in fact turn the question. Having in mind Popper's well-known objections about the value of induction. By the way, I assume that Popper can be used for my ends, of course. The fact of disproving a proposition never says anything about the thing in itself. If something is not red, it can be of any other color except red. Of course, it could. Popper is not a hermeneutic thinker only because it still thinks that if you disprove that something is red, and even if it can be of any possible color, you say something about the world. Are you satisfied with that? Bah, I don't know. I am not. I think that even Popper has to admit that all our arguments are arguments ad homines. I tell you why you don't have to believe that this is red. That's all. I don't know anything more about reality out there and so on. But this is just a parenthesis. All that does not allow us to say without doubt, beyond any objection, that it really is raining. In the end, we can only say that the facts are precisely, I use the Italian terms fatti. Facts are fatti. But fatti is the past participle of fare, of making. So they are made. The facts are made. Or even the given is given. Somebody gives. So I cannot take simply, there is also a way of translating the principle of reason in Leibniz, principium redende rationis, which is used by Heidegger in some of his essays. The principle of the reason to be given. You ask somebody to give you the reason why, and not reasonable is what is there. It is necessary also that somebody renders the reason to somebody else. Even the hyperbolic thesis, according to which one ought to conclude that a fact not ascertained by me or by anyone else does not exist, has a very limited importance. When I say, however, that the fact must exist, I am only saying it is possible that I myself or some other can verify it in the future, but nothing more. If not that, the question returns to the thing in itself, which I can always think, but never verify phenomenally, and about which, therefore, I can no longer say, as a Tarskian would like, that it exists independently of me. The experimental knowledge of reality, I realize that to argue this way in an environment like this, not only in a Scottish university, but in an Anglo-Saxon philosophical frame, is a sort of suicidal act. Okay, so simply note that I am aware of that, but I couldn't eliminate this part of my argument. The experimental knowledge of reality on which scientific propositions are founded and which implies the repeatability of the experiment by anyone else is also a strong argument in favor of my thesis about interpretation. The objectivity of the phenomenon that it describes consists in the repeatability of the experiment by other researchers. The presence of a method and the use of sophisticated instruments, however, does not distinguish this repetition of experiences in any essential way from those of shared everyday life. One always deals with other subjects who have asked to confirm or deny, who are asked to confirm or deny a particular interpretation of events. I draw this idea also from my Aristotelian studies. Contrary to any appearance, I am also an Aristotelian. No, I wrote a dissertation when I was, for my graduation, on Aristotle and the poiesis and the making. Now, what interested me in Aristotle also was that between the empiricist, who knows how to cure you for a stomach ache, and the expert in medicine, there is only a difference, sometimes even in favor of the empiricist, because but the medical expert is only the one who has organized the knowledge of the empiricist within a sort of syllogistical structure, which is more transmissible, more universalism, more teachable in many senses, but no more than that in Aristotle. So the idea that scientific knowledge, being closer to the very essence of the thing, knows it better, and therefore it is true out of any interpretation, is arbitrary, at least, in my opinion. Of course, it is possible to discuss it, but not too much, please. So, are we talking about the fact that when I state something as a truth, I ask other people to confirm? I invite other people to confirm it. And not much more than that. I'm talking about events. I call people to, I ask people to confirm that it's going like that. But events are such only because they can be experienced repeatedly. Would this also be one of the meanings of the Aristotelian expression toti eneinai? What being was? The essence in Aristotle was also called toti eneinai. So that what the being was. Should we be shocked by the element of chance that is thus introduced in the very notion of reality? The other people verify it, and it would be a scandal like the one caused by pragmatism, because when you state that truth is what is good for us, people say, what is good for you? You think that truth is just something so hazardous, so relative to the situation and so on. But pragmatism, or this idea that reality depends on the chances of being verified, like a work of art forgotten for centuries. You remember that even Shakespeare's tragedies, except in England probably, were not so estimated in the period of the rationalistic Corneille and Racine. And so it was not verified by anybody. Even Dante was needed to be revindicated by the Romantic critic. Schelling himself wrote an essay on Dante defending its true poetry, which was no longer recognized. Why do I take these examples, which were not written in my text? Probably don't help. But it is because all what is historical is related to change, to what happens, to imagine all the question of the classics, which are lost because they took fire somewhere in the world. No, we don't know anything about the poetry of blah, 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 because we don't know anything. So the question of the possible scandalous chance character of truth, thought of in these terms, appears only if we think that reality must be something outside. So if you say, is this an interpretation? I say yes. And if you say, but just an interpretation, in that just, there is already the prejudice that there must be something outside. And this is all the game, the end of the game. As often, of course, I have skipped some parts, so try to reconnect this unconnectable discourse. As often occurs in the case of radical empiricism, this is a solipsistic argument. If there is no fact outside of me, there is only I who would absurdly pretend to determine reality itself. Once again, however, the absurd would rest in the fact that reality must be there, external. But my interpretation is not born from zero, and there's nothing to do with the encounter of a subject with an object as a one-to-one relation. As in the case of givenness, thought in terms of repeatability of the experiment, I am not an isolated subject. I speak a language, I use a vocabulary, and therefore a syntax and a set of criteria for validity. In conclusion, that which gives reality to the facts that I interpret is the history into which I have been placed. The objects, a Marxist would say, are crystallized social relations. So, in order to limit the scandal of pragmatism or even of Kantianism and so on, we have to interpret these theories as historicist. I mean, I am never an isolated subject who says that things are as they are. I speak a language, but if I speak a language, I am within a tradition which constitutes the reality of reality. I go on these points. Would a similar interpretation be enough to satisfy the problem of argumentability raised by the realists? The risk that they indicate, and with reason, is one, if one begins with their solipsistic presuppositions, is that there would be no way to place shared belief into discussion. The Kantian distinction between noumenon and phenomenon is useful here when integrated, forget the previous part. The Kantian distinction between noumenon and phenomenon is useful here when integrated with Heidegger's famous affirmation that science doesn't think. Just in order to provoke a little bit more my Anglo-Saxon philosophical enemies, I remind you the sentence of Heidegger saying, Wissenschaft denkt nicht. Science doesn't think. It's horrible. Horrible reactions are stimulated by that. But this is just Kant, because Kant would read that science knows phenomena and reason thinks the noumenon. Noumenon is the Greek word for thought, a thought in terms of being thought. So, again, if you think in these terms, a Kantian or a hermeneutic would say that in terms of truth of fact, we have always enough light to establish whether a proposition is true or not. The problem arises when we speak in terms of the noumenon, or what Thomas Kuhn would call paradigms. The horizon within which facts are verified or falsified. Something that Thomas Kuhn would call normal science, in the realm of which problems are resolved by using accepted paradigms that are not subjected to critique. What I am alluding to is we exist always within a horizon of language, criteria, paradigms, and so on. Within that horizon, which would be the phenomenological reason of Kant, the theoretical knowledge, scientific knowledge in Kant, there is always enough light to distinguish between and so on. But what about the horizon itself? And this is the importance of Thomas Kuhn's notion of paradigms. You don't decide within which paradigm you are living. You don't choose your paradigm, because you would need another paradigm to compare the different paradigms, a meta-paradigm, of course, and so on. This is very well known. This is important because, of course, it's important. Kuhn is not a neutral thinker. He's somebody who took very much from hermeneutics, by the way. It is the hermeneutic agent in the field of epistemology, more or less. Okay, I know. We don't pay him for that, but as a matter of fact, he's our spy in the field of epistemology. But it is very useful to refer to him, because I don't know how an empiricist would go out of that situation. Excuse me, I jump above. See, I jump. Let me jump. But you have to help me jumping, because otherwise you cannot follow. So there is, let me come back to the starting point of the who is saying that the second P is outside of the quotation marks, and why is he saying that? This is what Paul Ricoeur would call with an expression of Nietzsche, they call the suspect, the school of suspect, because who really wants the second P to be outside the quotation marks? Keep this in mind, and let me go on trying to connect everything, if possible. It is not surprising that the history of hermeneutics is profoundly intertwined with the entire history of modern Europe. Even before the Protestant Reformation took its radically political meaning, the question of interpretation had already for some time begun to place in doubt the definitive nature of the paradigms in use and their authority. Even the problem of how to read in ethically correct ways the often dishonest and suspect behavior of Homer's gods was a problem of socially enforced paradigms. Or if one thinks of the pedagogical function that belonged to the Homeric poems, and obviously this discourse is still more relevant for the ways of reading the Holy Scripture, theorized and debated by medieval hermeneutics. Spiritual reading, allegorical reading, anagogical reading, literal reading, and so on. These were always a way to, again, to start a sort of hermeneutic analysis of our attitude towards the Scripture. If one reflects on these examples, it also becomes clear that the problem of interpretation does not really arise in determinate moments. It always accompanies the debate over the paradigms in use. It represents in them an intimate critical vocation that is activated in diverse ways, above all in relation to social and political facts. I am suggesting that when you ask who is interested in putting the second P outside of the quotation marks, there is a political interest, very, very brutally said, or economical interest, or some interest. Luther did not begin preaching the liberal examination of Scripture only to meet a demand born in theoretical reflection. He wanted to rebel against the papacy and against the corrupt condition into which the church of that time had fallen. Did this have anything to do with the society of his time? It is not so arbitrary to think that he had at heart the sort of poor who were exploited in every way, also and especially in the name of religious motivations. Certainly he was a monk, and therefore one could expect that he would not have had motives for rebelling against a condition of privilege that he himself enjoyed. It is clear that the sociological explanation of his revolt cannot be pushed ahead very far for the risk of the absurdity of a simplistic determinism. But since we are looking for the reasons why the crisis of a paradigm develops, remember the Kuhn famous example of Copernicus against Ptolemaios and so on and so forth, we can think that in Luther there was at work a mechanism analogous to that which can be seen in the generally greater tendency of the social critique by humanistic intellectuals in respect to scientific ones. Are scientists really revolutionary? Generally, they are conservatives. I tell this very clearly. I accuse them of being conformist and reactionary. But very clearly, very, very elementary, they depend on the subventions of the rich. Political power, Pentagon, private industries, and so on and so forth. So it is very understandable. But in many senses, it is true that where did explode the revolt of '68 or the years later? Always in the humanities in the universities. Not at all, or sometimes there were also physicists in that, but they depend so much on the structure of accepted canon of reality that it's very rare that they revolt. This is a sort of marginal observation. Of course, I don't want to say that all scientists are reactionary and all humanists are revolutionary. But if not all, many among them. Can we speak provocatively of a nominal marginality for this phenomenon? It's a very nice invention of this paper, nominal marginality. I will use it alluding to my Gifford lectures later. Nominal marginality, which perhaps a definition that is not too paradoxical, which perhaps simply translates the revolutionary vocation of Marx's proletariat into Kantian language. For whatever this reference is worth, it is in the end clear that the crisis of a theoretical paradigm, even in the Ptolemaic one, is not exclusive to theory, but involves more than we tend to believe the events of social subjects, individuals and groups who are interested in them. Remember, I think you know pretty well the book by Thomas Kuhn on the structure of scientific revolutions. Now, he admits that the birth of the new paradigm, or the success of the new paradigm, was not warranted by the fact that they had compared. Of course, it was not possible. A comparison by principle in Thomas Kuhn is not possible because we would need a meta-paradigm to put the two paradigms in relations. Okay. And this happened somehow, of course, because of many limitations which became clearer and clearer in the previous paradigm, but with no specific crucial experiment, of course. At the point that Kuhn says that at a certain moment the Ptolemaic paradigm was lost because the disciples of the Ptolemaics died. So they were no longer. It is more or less like finding Marxists in the European culture. Where is the Marx? No, I never was. In Italy, the previous communist leaders used to say, no, I never was a communist. So they disappeared. There was no experiment, maybe that, but okay. Let's remain with Thomas Kuhn. The transition from a paradigm to the other one is a complex historical event which has no point of, no visible starting point. Of course, something happens, but you cannot indicate that at a certain moment, you would say, yeah, but at the very end we discovered that the sun is immobile in the center of the yes, I mean, I don't have doubts about that. But the fact that they couldn't oppose strongly one paradigm to the other, by the way, the Pope doesn't believe that the sun stays in the middle. He has still some doubts, like Feyerabend, by the way. He has Feyerabend on his side, more or less. I mean, we admit, of course. By the way, why don't I care to discuss strongly that? I am not an astronomer. If I were an astronomer, I would try to show that one is right and the other is wrong because I want to win the Nobel Prize, which in physics and astronomy exists. By the way, if I was a priest in the 16th century, well, I would be worried about the fact that if people don't believe any longer in the immobility of the sun, the immobility of the earth, and the mobility of the sun, they will no more respect the laws of the church. Read the Life of Galileo by Bertolt Brecht. It is all a story around that. I mean, if somebody discovers that it is not true what we learned from the Bible and so on, then okay, everything is okay. We can do what we want and so on and so forth. So again and again, even the idea of the fact that the sun is immobile and the earth moves around is a truth, of course. I don't doubt of it because I don't have any reason to doubt of it. But it is not a theoretical reason. By the way, we usually say still now that the sun rises up and sets down. So we still use that expression of the Ptolemaic tradition. So that all the meaning of this discussion, which is going to the end, not of reality, but to the end of my paper for tonight, is that the question of the quotation marks is a question of historicity of our knowledge, of the situated character of any scientific or everyday experience, without any chances to attribute to something an independent existence out there. I am not following a lateral path in respect to the center of my discourse. To pose the question of why and how the problem of facts versus interpretations arises is also a way of responding to my main question. How is a critical attitude possible that does not appeal to the difference between objective truth and error? What still remains of truth in the position I am now defending? If we think of truth in terms of nominal marginality, this refers not only to the Marxist idea of the revolutionary proletariat, but also to the phrase from the gospel according to which the truth will set you free. Tarski, quotation marks, things outside there. I show you that you are not, that you are wrong because there is something, etc. All this has to do with the veritas who sets me free or not. What I am trying to develop, criticizing the quotation marks of Tarski and so on, is only the fact that I'm looking for a notion of truth closer to the idea of freedom. If something is out there, given objectively once and for all, given by somebody whom I don't know, to whom I cannot ask questions, the eureka of the very of the discovery is, I remain with open mouth. I don't have, there is no longer anything to ask. By the way, this would be the only possible definition of violence in philosophical terms. Let me have this parenthesis too, and then I try to conclude, if it is possible. Violence has always been defined, but even Hannah Arendt doesn't define violence. Because I say even Hannah Arendt indicating him because he made an allusion to my Arendt Prize. Probably they would call it back, like the Toyota cars, if I heard this. But even Hannah Arendt didn't define violence, even if she spoke very, very, very often of violence. Because the traditional idea of violence we have is always related to the essences. If you prevent somebody from doing something for which he is potentially prepared, this is violence. It's like speaking in Aristotelian terms. Fire goes up, stone goes down. If violence seems to be related generally to an essence which is prohibited to develop itself as it should naturally, cataphysin, following the nature. Now, the only violence I can imagine is if I don't take this idea of essences, is that somebody stops my questions. Quiet, tacitation, shut up. This is what it is. The thing outside is always what it is. You cannot ask questions about that. You can ask why, but why is related to somebody who has made that. You ask why and who gave this given, and so on and so forth. Now, the question of asking what is there beyond or contrary to my interpretation, if one raises this question, it is because one is not at ease with the paradigm in use. We do not feel at one with the group in society, with the pursuits shared by everyone. Also, philosophy speaks always of everyone, but not by us. So, are we not at ease with Tarski's simple proposition? If it rains, the thing has the same meaning for us as for everyone who lives alongside us. In fact, the question of the validity of paradigms does not arise with the problem of rain. I made already an allusion in this disordered progression. It does not arise with truth of fact, what for Kant would be topics for the science of phenomena. The questions that break the paradigm are nominal, values, ethics, ways of organizing social existence, general meaning of life, and so on and so forth. And the break occurs right when someone suggests that the reasonable way to deal with such questions is by reducing them to the level of truth of fact and searching for their solution with the method of science. Admittedly, we have placed ourselves on a slippery ground. What places us at odds with the Tarskian principle and with the Tarskians is the very idea of the paradigm and of its historicity. But once we admit that the paradigm is historical and not natural, how do we move forward? Namely, what truth do we suggest in place of Tarski's principle, or at least in place of its claim of universal value? Let's begin again from zero. Presented with the thesis that it is raining is true only if it is in fact raining, we object that the second "it is raining" should also be placed between quotation marks. There is a community that admits the existence of a certain reality to which it refers in order to decide what is true and what is false. On our part, we still ask who is included within this community of everyone. The question of the truth of it is raining becomes a question of negotiation with the community that professes and applies the paradigm. It is as if, by reflecting on a truth as elementary as it is raining, we discover that we are historical beings and that the greatest evidence available in the moment is constructed only with an agreement that can be placed under scrutiny and renegotiated. That which is, on what there is the title of a book by Quine, an essay by Quine. That which is, of which we predicate being, is not always and in any case, but occurs within a game of interpersonal relations. Having taken note that the affirmation of a truth also reflects a certain hierarchy of social power, does it or does it not make sense to hold on the thesis of truth as the correspondence of the proposition to the thing? Even the taking note that it makes sense can withstand the obvious objections of Tarskians. Aren't we putting forward truth of fact as arguments? Sure, but neither the taking note or, above all, recognizing that something makes sense are things analogous to the "it's raining" of Tarski. What we are saying is one of the ways of claiming that if there is something like the external reality of the Tarskians, it is only the whole of the interpretation shared and canonized in a certain society and in a determinate historical moment. To propose a different socio-historical order, even beginning from the dissatisfaction with certain aspects of the paradigm in use, certainly cannot be done with cogent arguments of the ostensive sort. So I will show you that. But only with edifying or exhortative propositions like, don't you feel that it would be better if, and so on and so forth. You see that in this sense, the nominal word is also a word of uncertainty, of existential uncertainty and interpersonal relationship. What I'm saying here is that the critique of judgment of Kant is to be put at the basis of the critique of pure reason. You can only practice and use theoretical general criteria only if you agree on a basis which is not demonstrative, apodictic, but lived with your community. We all know that Richard Rorty spoke about philosophy in an edifying, rather than apodictic discourse in his famous book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. In that book, he even had the courage, and in those years it took much more than today, early 80s, took the courage to point that to Dewey, Heidegger, and Wittgenstein as the three decided philosophers of the 20th century. Today, in many realms of philosophy, both Anglo-American and continental, it seems that these three figures have been forgotten in favor of a new realism that risks falling back into the idea of the mirroring of nature that Rorty wanted to liquidate, and that also has significant and dangerous political consequences, social and political consequences. To be anti-realists today is perhaps the only way to still be revolutionary. But I will go on in the next days if you allow me. Thank you. Very kind of you. I got sometimes lost, but please be faithful. Have hope still for the next days.
Professor Vattimo, we would wish to thank you very warmly for your first lecture, which has provoked us, as you can see, into many kinds of thinking, philosophical, political, religious. We wait with great eagerness for your next lecture, the same place and time tomorrow evening. As you go out, please, could I draw your attention to these leaflets on the table? The University Bookshop has a selection of the writings of Professor Vattimo, a number of his books, and there is in fact a reduction in the cost, so you can buy them for 10% off, provided you have one of these and take it with you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.